guys, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. If you're new here, my name's Jennifer. Here at Homestead on a Prayer, we're working on becoming a little more self-sufficient with a small property and an even smaller budget. And today, as you can see, we are in my kitchen and we are going to be making sourdough rye bread. Now I like my rye bread to be a little bit tangy and to have a lot of flavor. So that is the kind of bread that we're going to be making today. I am planning to make tuna melts for dinner tomorrow night because it's going to be really hot tomorrow. And so I want to be able to cook something that is not going to heat up my kitchen, that's going to be a satisfying meal to have on a really hot day. And if you're going to make a tuna melt the right way, you really need rye bread. And sourdough rye is the way to go. So I'm going to just take you over here. I'm going to show you all the ingredients that you're going to need to make this really delicious and easy sourdough bread. Now to make this sourdough rye bread recipe, you're going to need a sourdough starter. You're going to need some rye flour. You're going to need bread flour. You're going to need salt. You're going to need malt syrup. This recipe calls for malt syrup. That's a little bit of a more unusual ingredient. So I definitely recommend using the malt syrup if you have it or can get it. If that's a hard ingredient for you to find, you could substitute molasses or honey. It won't have quite the same depth of flavor, but it will still be delicious. Those are the ingredients that this recipe calls for. Because as I mentioned, I like a lot of extra flavor in my rye bread, we are going to use two optional ingredients as well. The first is minced onion. If you don't have minced onion, you could use onion powder instead. You could even use grated fresh onion. I haven't actually tried that, but I bet it would be amazing. I usually like the minced onion. You could leave it out completely if you don't want it. The other ingredient is brine from pickles. These are some pickles that I canned last summer from my garden, so I'm going to measure out some of the brine and replace some of the water in the recipe with that to give it some extra flavor. And you're going to need water. I forgot to mention that, but I think we pretty much all have access to water. Okay, to get started with our bread, the first thing that you're going to need to measure out is 1 cup of sourdough starter. You can see I have just a hair under a cup here, but it's going to work fine. We may just end up having to let it rise slightly longer, but it'll still work fine. So let's go ahead and scrape that into our bowl. The next ingredient that we're going to need is our liquid. Now this recipe calls for 1.5 cups of warm water. Because, as I mentioned, I am replacing some of that water with pickle juice, I'm going to strain out 3/4 of a cup of pickle juice into this measuring cup here. And then we're going to top it off with warm water to reach 1.5 cups total. Okay, so I just realized I had a camera clip that didn't record, but I just showed straining 3/4 of a cup of brine from our pickles into here and then topping it off with 3/4 of a cup of warm water so that we have 1.5 cups of liquid total. We're going to pour that in to our sourdough starter. Next, we're going to measure out 1 cup of rye flour, and we're going to add that in with our starter and liquid as well. Okay, so here we have 1 cup of rye flour. We're going to pour that into our mixture. Now to start with, we're going to start with just 1 cup of bread flour. We're going to add more bread flour later in this recipe, but what we're going to do is once we get all of this mixture incorporated, we're going to let it sit for about a half an hour so that the flour that we have in there so far can absorb the liquid. It just makes the bread a better consistency to really work with. So here I've got 1/2 cup of bread flour, and we're going to add 1 more 1/2 cup. Now we're going to mix this up. I recommend starting with your mixer on low speed so you don't create a cloud of bread flour in your kitchen. Just going to pulse it a few times. Okay, now that this mixture is fully incorporated, we're just going to cover it up with a clean towel and we're going to let this sit for about half an hour. So I will meet you back here after our dough has had a chance to sit. So our bread dough's been sitting for a little more than half an hour. Let's take a look. So it'd probably be more obvious in person, but you can see that the texture of this dough has changed a little bit. The flour has really absorbed the liquid and it's not quite as sticky looking as it was before. So the first thing we're going to do to add our new ingredients is we're going to switch out this paddle attachment here for the dough hook. So I'm just going to grab a spatula. Just scrape this dough off. So we're going to add our dough hook in. Now we're going to add 2 teaspoons of salt. I have kosher salt here, but you can use any kind of salt that you like to use. It's fine. So there's 1, 2. Now I'm going to add our minced onion. I don't really measure this. It's not really part of the recipe anyway. I just usually grab, I don't know, maybe a palmful or so. I don't know. It looks like maybe a tablespoon, something like that. I just kind of throw it in. Maybe a little more. You can just kind of do that to taste. Now we're going to need a tablespoon of our barley malt syrup. As I mentioned before, I do recommend getting some of the syrup. It's not that expensive, but it can be a little bit hard to find. And so if you have a hard time finding it, you can use molasses or honey. Now I will say this stuff is not the greatest to work with. I don't know if you can see, it really does not want to get in my spoon. It likes to stick together in long strings. So for that reason, it is a little bit challenging. So we're just gonna scrape some off and we're just going to try the best we can. I'm gonna say that that's about a tablespoon once I get that all in there. This stuff does add a really good flavor to your bread, but it's not the friendliest substance to work with. I feel like it's like, my goodness, I feel like it's like adding taffy to your bread, something like that. But we're just gonna get it in here and then we're gonna let the stand mixer do the rest of it and it won't be our problem anymore, right? So I'm just gonna give this a quick mix to incorporate these other ingredients and then we're going to add the rest of our flour. Okay, those are pretty much incorporated. So we're going to add 1.5 cups more of bread flour. And I forgot to mention at the beginning of this recipe, I'm going to put all the ingredients and measurements in the video description, so you don't have to worry about writing all of this down. I'm also going to link the original recipe. Even though I am changing the recipe quite a bit, I'll still link the original recipe that this bread was kind of inspired by. So we need about 1.5 cups of flour. I've got this, I put a cup in and now I've got that one about half full. Now we're going to mix this up with our dough hook. Again, start on slow speed with a couple pulses. Nothing like choking on a cloud of flour that's exploded into your face, right? Now we want to keep mixing this until the dough has really come together into kind of a cohesive ball and has started, what they say is clearing the sides of the bowl. That means it won't be stuck all on the sides of the bowl anymore. It might be stuck to the bottom of the bowl a little bit, but I mean, you can see even now, it's starting to form strands. It's starting to come together. Now, we'll watch this, and if it's really too sticky, it's not going to really clear the sides of the bowl, and that's an indicator that you might need more flour. But as you can see here, our dough is starting to clear the sides of the bowl already. You can see it's still stuck to the bottom, but the rest of it has really gathered around the dough hook, and that's a sign that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. Now that everything is really incorporated well in here and it's starting to behave the way we want it to, I'm going to turn up the speed a little bit. We're going to knead this for about 3 or 4 minutes, and then I'm going to meet you back here when we're done kneading. Okay, so we've got our dough in the bowl. It's ready to be transferred to another bowl to rise in. I've taken this bowl and I've sprayed it with cooking spray. So I'm going to grab this super, super sticky dough out of this bowl. It's pretty not super fun to touch and work with, but we're going to grab it as best we can. And we are going to just try to shape this into a round as well as you can. It's not going to be, as I said, super easy to work with because it's so sticky. So I'm just kind of grabbing the edges and pulling it into the middle as much as I can. Now you can see it's leaving a mess on my hands. It's not the easiest dough to work with, but just do the best you can. Plop it into this bowl over here that we've prepared with cooking spray or oiled. Now I'm going to go wash my hands. We're going to let this dough, you can see, there it is there. It's kind of shaggy right now. We're going to let that rest for half an hour in here. I'm going to meet you back here to do our first set of stretches and folds. Don't worry, this dough gets easier to work with as we go, so the stretches and folds will be easier than this initial shaping. Okay, so it's been just over half an hour. It's time to do our first set of stretches and folds. I'm going to take you over here and I'm going to show you what our dough looks like and show you how to do that. But first of all, I just want to say, do not stress about this process. If the thought of having to be tied down to a clock and do these stretches and folds is keeping you from trying sourdough bread, please don't let it. Just give it a try. The worst thing that can happen is your bread may not come out perfect. It'll still be delicious. It'll still be edible. It'll still be homemade. These stretches and folds are the ideal suggestion. If you're around and you're able to do them, great. If not, just do what you can and it's still gonna come out good. So we're gonna uncover this. You can see it looks like it's absorbed a little bit more of the water. It doesn't look quite as wet as it did before. So to do our stretches and folds, if you've seen my previous sourdough videos, you've seen this already. But you're just going to go around, grab one end of the bread and fold it into the middle. Now remember, I told you that this dough was going to get so much easier to work with as we went on, and it is definitely true. It's still nice and smooth. It's not sticky anymore. So we basically put everything into the middle, kind of shape it into a ball, and then just flip it over so the smooth side's on the top. Now we're going to cover that back up. We'll be back to do this again in half an hour, and then again an hour after that. I'll show you those really quickly, and then I'll meet you back here when we're ready to move on. Alright guys, so we're back to do our final set of stretches and folds. We're going to take a look at our dough. We'll do the set of stretches and folds, and then I'm going to pop it in the refrigerator. Now normally I would put it in the refrigerator overnight and then shape it and bake it the next morning. I started this bread first thing in the morning because I was hoping to get it completely baked in one day because it's supposed to be so hot tomorrow. I just don't want to have to turn on my oven. So let's take a look at our bread and we will see how it looks. Alright, so we're going to uncover our bread. That looks good. So I've been noticing as I've been doing these stretches and folds, the bread is getting easier and easier to work with. It's less sticky. Now this is a little bit of a sticky dough, so it's a little sticky still, but it's so much easier to work with. It doesn't completely coat my hands anymore. So that's our last stretch and fold set. I'm just going to kind of shape it into a round there. So you can see, looks pretty good there. And of course, now that I just said it's not as sticky, you can see my hands now. Anyway, I'm going to cover this. I'm going to pop it in the fridge. It's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon now. So rather than keep it in the fridge overnight, I am going to leave it in the fridge for a few hours. I'm going to shape and bake it tonight so I can avoid turning on my oven when it's going to be almost 100 degrees tomorrow. So I would rather not have my oven on. So I'm going to leave it in the fridge until probably about 7 or so. So I'll have about 4 hours in the fridge. I will meet you back here when it's ready to shape. Okay, it's later the same night. I've taken our bread dough out of the fridge. I took it out of the fridge probably about an hour and a half or so ago to let it come up to room temperature. It's much easier to shape if you let it warm up a little bit before you shape it. So there are a couple reasons why you want to chill your dough in the fridge before shaping it, rather than just letting it rise completely at room temperature the whole time. One reason is that it slows down the fermentation process. And so if you, for example, if you're putting it in the fridge overnight, you're not, unless your house is on the cool side, you're not going to want to leave it at room temperature overnight because it's going to over ferment. So the refrigerator, the cold temperatures of the refrigerator really slow it down. Another reason is that your sourdough starter is made up of a mix of beneficial bacteria and yeast. And those different, basically microorganisms or whatever you want to call them, they basically operate at different temperatures. And so by putting it in the refrigerator, you're going to develop a little bit of a different flavor than if you left it out at room temperature the whole time. So that is the main reason why I went ahead and put our dough in the refrigerator for a couple hours. So I'm just going to bring you over here. We're going to shape our bread and I will show you how to do that. Okay, so now it's time to shape our dough. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to lightly flour our counter here. We don't want a real lot of flour because we want the dough to stick just a little bit. So I'm going to lightly flour it. And then we're just going to kind of scrape our dough out of the bowl onto the flour. Now, because I'm going to be using this bread for sandwiches, I want to kind of shape a fairly long skinny loaf. So you want to start by making your dough pretty round. Then you're going to grab the 2 back corners here and fold them over. And then you see this weird thing that's kind of sticking up. You're going to push that down. Then we're going to spin our bread around. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. fold over the two corners and then push that weird little bump down. Now we're basically going to now fold it in half along itself, and we're going to pinch the seam closed. Now see how this is shaping into a nice sandwich loaf? Now we're going to just roll it out a little bit more just to make it a little bit longer. And this is the part where you don't really want a lot of flour, because it's going to create some nice tension along the crust of your bread, and that is what is going to allow it to keep its shape while it rises for the last time and while it bakes. So we have a nice shape there. I'm going to put it on this cookie sheet here that I've lined with a silicone baking mat. You can also use parchment paper if you don't have a silicone baking mat. So I'm just going to carefully transfer this bread dough onto this cookie sheet here. Now I'm going to cover that with a clean towel. I'm going to let it rise for about an hour and a half. When it's pretty close to doubled in size, it's going to be ready to bake. So I am going to meet you back here once it's ready. So our bread's been rising for about an hour and a half. It's time to get it in the oven. And I gotta say, it's late, guys. I am definitely rethinking my life choices when it comes to baking this bread tonight instead of tomorrow. But tomorrow, when it's like in the 90s and super hot in my house, I will be thankful then. But as for right now, I'm just gonna try to get this done quickly so I can go relax for a little bit before it's time for bed. So I'm gonna show you how our bread looks right now. We're going to go ahead and prep it and get it in the oven. All right, so let's uncover our bread and see what it looks like. Looks nice and risen. It's a lot puffier than it was before. So the first thing that we're going to need to do, we're going to prepare an egg wash to brush the top of our bread with. I have chosen one of my smallest eggs from my egg basket, so I'm going to go ahead and make that into an egg wash here. So I think the recipe said to just use an egg white, but I'm just going to use the whole egg. So just got that nice and scrambled up with my fork there. Now the next thing that you're going to need to do is score the top of your bread. I found out since my last sourdough video that this scoring tool is called a lame. Pretty sure that I am pronouncing it right now. So I'm just going to make probably about 4 or 5 diagonal slits down the bread. You want to do this pretty precisely, pretty quickly and confidently. You don't want to be hesitant because that's going to lead to tearing your bread. So let's go ahead and make some slices. I'll just move this out of the way so you can see a little better. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so we have 5 slits in the bread. You can see how I just made some diagonal slits. And scoring your bread just kind of directs the opening. It's going to rise in the oven. And so by scoring it, you are telling the bread what direction you want it to rise in, and you're controlling the eventual, basically the eventual shape of your finished loaf. So rather than getting some weird misshapen loaf that has like a giant blob off the back of it or something, you are controlling it, and you should end up with a nicely shaped loaf. So I scored it maybe 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch deep. You want to score deeply enough that your bread is going to be able to have enough space to open up, but not so deeply that you've really damaged the shape and the structure of your loaf. So now I've just brushed our egg wash all over the bread. I'll brush it in the slits too. I've got our oven preheated to 425 degrees. It's ready for our bread to go in. Here's what our bread looks like. You can see it's nice and shiny from the egg wash. So our recipe calls for this bread to bake for about 35 minutes. So I'm going to set the timer for 30 minutes and check on it then. I'll meet you back here as soon as it's ready to take out of the oven. Right, so our timer just went off. Let's open up the oven and take a look at our bread. Yep, that's definitely done. Nice and browned. So our bread's all done now. Time to let it cool, and that's going to make some delicious tuna melts for dinner tomorrow night. So I hope that you will give this bread recipe a try. I think it's a really delicious rye bread recipe. It's great for tuna, great for sandwiches. It's just, if you like rye bread, especially if you like it with a little tang and extra flavor, this is a great recipe to try. So I hope you'll give it a try. If you do try it, just leave a comment and let me know how you like it. And I will see you guys later. Bye guys. Have a good night.